May 16th, 2000, SoHo, New York City. A conference hotel, the kind with a registration desk and lanyards and a continental breakfast with those little yogurt cups nobody touches. The people in this room are technology executives, venture capitalists, digital media analysts. They are not a crowd that gets surprised easily. Courtney Love walks to the microphone, and for the next 45 minutes, she does something no one in that room was prepared for. She does math. Not rockstar math, not magazine interview math where you say something vague about money and everyone nods. Actual, specific, line item. Here is where every dollar goes math about what happens to a recording artist inside a major label contract. And when she's done, the number at the bottom of the ledger, after album sales, after a hit record, why, after 1 million copies sold, is zero. The band gets zero. The label gets $11 million. She called it sharecropping. Not as a rhetorical flourish, as a description. That speech was published in Salon magazine 4 weeks later. It was read by hundreds of thousands of people, lawyers, musicians, journalists, a handful of people on Capitol Hill. She was called a lot of things in the coverage that followed: unstable, attention-seeking, self-serving. One publication described the speech as a rant. Another spent 4 paragraphs on what she was wearing. Nobody called her right. And here's the thing, she was completely, precisely, almost prophetically right about how the contracts worked, about what the accounting hid, about what was going to happen when artists finally understood what they'd signed, about why it mattered. We were looking right at her in the year 2000 and we missed it entirely. So let's go back. Because the story of what happened to Courtney Love isn't the story we were told. It's a lot quieter than that and a lot more uncomfortable. And it started long before a hotel in SoHo. There's a specific kind of texture to listening to Live Through This for the first time. If you were somewhere in your teens or early 20s in 1994, you probably remember where you were. Not because the album arrived gently, because it didn't. It was loud, and it was ugly, and it was honest in a way that a lot of music that year was actively trying not to be. And underneath all of that, there was something that felt almost unbearably sad. The kind of sad that had nowhere to go and knew it. The album came out on April 12, 1994. 4 days later, Kurt Cobain was dead. Yeah, there's no version of that timeline that isn't a lot to hold. She went on tour anyway. Hole had a record to promote, a band to keep together, a career she had built separate from her marriage, and she went. And every night for months she stood at a microphone in front of audiences who were still actively processing their grief about her husband, and she played her own music, and she got through it. We have a tendency, when we look back at Courtney Love in the 1990s, to collapse her story into someone else's, to treat her primarily as a character in a narrative about Nirvana, rather than as the lead in a narrative about herself. I want to push back on that a little. Not because the Nirvana story isn't real, it is, and we'll come back to it, but because it's part of what kept us from seeing clearly what was actually happening with her career. Live through this. Then, 4 years of touring, of band upheaval, of keeping Hole alive as a functioning band rather than just a name on a marquee. And then, Celebrity Skin in 1998, the album that finally unambiguously brought Hole into the mainstream. MTV rotation, 15 magazine covers, a Grammy nomination, a sold-out tour with 9 Inch Nails. By 1998, Hole had sold close to 4 million albums in the United States. Total retail, roughly $50 million. That is a real number from real record stores where real people put real money on a counter and bought a CD. Courtney Love and her band received approximately $2 million, not $2 million each, $2 million total for the 4 of them, across 6 years. If you're doing the math on that, and she was, you already know where this is going. But I want to take a second before we get to the fight, because this part matters. There was a moment, before any of it went sideways, when Celebrity Skin was on the radio and Hole was everywhere, and she was genuinely, measurably at the top of what she'd built. And she'd built it herself, out loud, in front of everyone, through everything. I just want to stay here for a second, because that's what we're actually talking about losing. Let me tell you exactly what she said in that room in Soho. She started with a hypothetical, a band, a bidding war, $1 million advance, a 20% royalty rate, best case scenario in other words, and she walked through it dollar by dollar. The band spends half the advance recording the album. They pay their manager, their lawyer, their business manager. They're down to $45,000 per person for a year until the record releases. The record comes out. It sells 1 million copies. The label requires 2 music videos, $1 million total. The band pays half. That's recoupable. Out of royalties, tour support $200,000, recoupable, independent radio promotion, the system where labels pay middlemen to get songs played on radio stations, and then the cost gets charged to the band, $300,000, recoupable, the original $1 million advance, recoupable, when you add it up, the band owes $2 million in recoupable costs. Their royalties at 1 million albums sold, also $2 million, net balance $0. The band earns nothing. The label grosses $11 million. She did not say this was illegal. She said, "This is how it works. This is the standard contract. Every label uses this structure. There is no alternative contract. You either sign this or you don't get signed." And then she said something that I've thought about a lot since I found that speech. She called it sharecropping. For those of you who took American history, you know what sharecropping was. It was the post-Civil War system where black farmers in the South were technically free. They could farm the land, but all the seeds, all the tools, all the equipment was provided by the landowner, and all the costs were charged against the crop. No matter how good the harvest was, the debt always seemed to come out ahead of the profit. You could work your whole life and never own the house. She was describing a music contract using the vocabulary of involuntary servitude, and she wasn't done. Here's the part that barely got covered, even in the outlets that ran the speech. In November 1999, 6 months before this speech, a congressional aide named Mitch Glazier, working with the support of the RIAA, had quietly inserted a 2-word amendment into a piece of legislation. After all the hearings on the bill were finished, after the public comment period had closed, after the vote, in the text cleanup phase, when aides are technically only allowed to make spelling corrections, the 2 words were, "work for hire." Under the Copyright Act of 1978, recording artists could reclaim ownership of their music after 35 years. It was a long wait, an entire generation, but it was something, a family legacy, a piece of what you made. The work for hire amendment erased that. If a recording is classified as a work for hire, the label owns it in perpetuity, forever, not 35 years, forever. The same legal category as a standardized test or a technical manual. Writing "Hey Jude" is now legally equivalent to writing a spelling workbook. The bill was signed into law. 3 months later, the RIAA hired Mitch Glazier as their top lobbyist at a salary that was, by any account, significantly larger than what he had been making as a spelling corrector. None of us knew this had happened. She did. She stood in that room in Soho in May 2000 and told a room full of technology executives that the music industry had just quietly stolen the copyright reversions of every recording artist in America in the middle of the night through a piece of legislation about satellite television. And then she went home, and the coverage the next morning was mostly about the pants. Here's the thing about Courtney Love's lawsuit that I want to make sure we understand before we get into the mechanics of it. She'd been trying to leave her label for months before anyone filed anything. She had notified Interscope, the Universal division her contract had landed with, after Geffen was absorbed by MCA, which was absorbed by Seagram, which was absorbed by Vivendi, the French utilities company, on December 19, 1999, and that she would no longer record for them. She had signed with Geffen in 1992. Geffen was a boutique American rock label, the same label that had Sonic Youth, that had developed Nirvana. She chose Geffen specifically because of who they were and what they understood about her music. By the time she tried to leave, Geffen no longer existed. Her contract had been bought, sold, reassigned, and transferred through 4 corporate mergers without her knowledge or consent. She went to sleep one night signed to an American rock label and woke up, contractually, owned by a French utilities corporation. She had never consented to any of those transfers. The contract had an assignment clause that allowed the company to sell her to whoever they wanted, whenever they wanted, for as long as the contract lasted. Then Universal's response to her December notice was to sue her in January 2000. The claim: she owed them 5 undelivered albums. The potential damages: $100 million. She filed a countersuit in February 2001. The core of her case was California Labor Code Section 2855, the 7-year statute, a law that said you cannot bind any person to an employment contract for more than 7 years. It was created in the 1940s, based on a case brought by Olivia de Havilland, the film actress who sued to break free from a studio contract that had kept her working under the same terms for nearly a decade. Recording artists had always technically been covered by this law. But in 1987, major labels sent lobbyists to the California Senate with testimony about how prohibitive their development costs were, how artists took years to become profitable, how without long contracts the entire industry would collapse. The Senate passed an amendment specific to the music industry, allowing labels to pursue damages against any artist who tried to leave before their album obligations were fulfilled. Attorney Don Engel, who had represented both Donna Summer and Don Henley in past contract disputes, testified against that amendment. He said the record companies had lied to the legislators, that their development cost testimony was simply not true. Nobody listened. Love's suit alleged the same thing, that the 1987 amendment had been passed through false testimony, that the standard recording contract was designed to keep artists in place for 14 years or more, because labels required 2-year gaps between albums, which meant a 5-album deal was structurally a 14-year deal, which covered most music careers in their entirety. Her legal team wasn't entertainment lawyers. She had deliberately gone outside the industry. Her lead attorney was a trial lawyer who had won verdicts against Bank of America. She had hired the private investigator who helped the tobacco whistleblower Jeffrey Wigand. She said at the time, and I keep coming back to this quote, "I could end up being the music industry's worst nightmare, a smart woman with a fat bank account who is unafraid to go down in flames fighting for a principle." In January 2002, the court issued a ruling that allowed her 7-year challenge to proceed. An attorney who had seen similar cases said, "If this goes to trial, it will be a jury that decides the facts, not the industry." She was one step from a jury. That's when the phone rang. What happened next requires you to understand one thing. Courtney Love, through her position as administrator of Kurt Cobain's estate, controlled, among other things, the approval process for any posthumous Nirvana release. She had that authority. She had fought for it. Universal, through its subsidiary label, held the distribution rights to Nirvana's catalog. There was one unreleased Nirvana recording sitting in that catalog, a demo called "You Know You're Right." It was the last song Kurt Cobain had recorded in the studio. It had never been released. It was worth, commercially and culturally, an enormous amount. According to reporting from the LA Times, as the legal proceedings were moving forward in 2002, while Universal made clear that they intended to proceed with a Nirvana release, including that recording, whether or not a deal with Love was in place, they did not need her approval for the release itself. And if the song leaked, or if the release moved forward without a negotiated framework, the leverage it represented for her side of the legal fight evaporated. She settled in October 2002. She was released from her recording contract. She retained ownership of some unreleased whole recordings. Universal got to release "You Know You're Right" as part of a Nirvana compilation. They retained a percentage of her next 2 solo albums. The 7-year case never went to a jury. The woman who had said, in writing, in a published speech, in a deposition, in multiple interviews, that the standard recording contract was the central form of exploitation in the American music industry, settled and went quiet. And the coverage, almost without exception, described it as a loss, as the inevitable outcome of a woman who had overreached. I want to say this carefully, because I think precision matters here. She was not defeated by a better legal argument. She was not defeated because Universal proved her wrong. She was defeated because the company holding her husband's final recording, a recording she had fought to protect, used that recording as a negotiating position in a commercial dispute. Those are different things. I've thought a lot about what it costs to sit across a table from that. After the settlement, Courtney Love made a solo album. She did interviews, she toured. She remained a public figure in the way that people remain public figures when they are too recognizable to disappear, but no longer occupy the center of the conversation. The coverage, in the years that followed, continued to be predominantly about her personal life, about instability, about court appearances, about financial difficulties. The speech in SoHo got cited occasionally in academic papers about music industry economics, almost never in mainstream outlets, almost never in connection with her name. And then, things started changing. In 2014, Taylor Swift wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about the devaluation of music. She pulled her entire catalog from Spotify. The argument she made about the relationship between artists and their work, about who benefits from streaming revenue, about what music is worth, landed with enormous cultural force. Every major outlet ran it. She was described as courageous, as a visionary, as someone who had changed the conversation about how the music industry treats its artists. She had. And she deserved that recognition. But I keep thinking about a hotel in SoHo. In 2019, Taylor Swift publicly lost the masters to her first 6 albums when they were sold to Scooter Braun as part of a business acquisition she hadn't been consulted about. She was devastated. She was vocal. The internet responded with a solidarity that was genuine and widespread. A whole generation of music fans learned, for the first time, what a master recording was and why it mattered and what it meant for an artist to not own the thing they had made. Courtney Love had been trying to explain this in 2000, during a published speech, to anyone who would read it. Kesha's lawsuit against her producer about a contract she described as psychologically and professionally imprisoning. The details she laid out about how a recording agreement can function as a trap, about the economics of recoupment, about how inescapable those terms become once you're inside them, matched, almost point for point, what Love had put in front of a room full of tech executives 19 years earlier. Prince wrote "slave" on his face and changed his name to an unpronounceable symbol to protest the exact same thing. He became a joke. He was right. I'm not saying Courtney Love was the only person who understood how record contracts worked. Music industry attorneys had known for decades. Some artists had talked about it. A few had fought individual battles. But she was the person who did the math in public, who named the mechanism precisely, with numbers, in language anybody could follow, in the year 2000, and then put her career behind it by actually filing the lawsuit. And what happened to her in the years that followed was not what happens to someone whose argument gets refuted. It was what happens to someone whose argument is too expensive to engage with. We labeled her unstable. We described her speech as a rant. We focused with impressive consistency on everything except what she had actually said. And she stopped being the kind of person whose ideas the conversation was organized around, and became instead the kind of person who appears in listicles and gets the "still making headlines for all the wrong reasons" framing. I've been sitting with this for a while. Because I think we, not the industry, not the label executives, we, the people who read the coverage and absorbed the narrative and moved on, we participated in that, not maliciously, not consciously. We just trusted the frame we were handed. We looked at the pants and not the math. She is still alive. She makes music occasionally. She gives interviews. There is no Hollywood ending here. No moment where the credits roll and the score swells, and someone, somewhere, stands up and says, "She was right and we owe her an apology." That is not how these things work. The people who held the contracts have the masters. The people who changed the law have the law. The woman who stood at the microphone and did the math is, depending on who you ask, either a cautionary tale or a footnote. Here's what I keep coming back to. Somewhere in the last 5 years, the conversation about artists and rights and masters and contracts and who owns what and who benefits from what, that conversation became mainstream. It's in every music journalism outlet. It's in op-eds and documentaries and congressional testimony. It's the framework through which we now understand what happened to dozens of artists across multiple decades. We're having that conversation right now, in 2026, with the vocabulary she handed us in 2000. Nobody called her back.